A Comanche man kneeling sack, hooded at church. Inside the sack, a white baby. Crying, the steps of the Redemption Gulch church were a sacred yet desolate space, a place exuding an uneasy silence, palpable dread, and the gathering storm of a terrible question. Dawn broke to reveal a bizarre offering left at God's door. A man was kneeling motionlessly, a large grain sack pulled over his head and torso, his hands bound. His unnerving stillness was not the posture of a prisoner, but of a messenger waiting for his sermon to be read. He was a riddle written in flesh and burlap, a silent reckoning. Then a sound so impossible it froze the blood. Muffled, desperate, it seemed to come from the chest of the hooded figure himself. It was not a warrior's grunt or a prisoner's groan. It was the thin, wailing cry of a baby. The town's greatest secret had just been delivered, a living, breathing mystery hidden inside the silhouette of their deepest fear. What in tarnation had come to their door, dawn in Redemption Gulch, was a brittle, fragile thing. It did not spill over the jagged mesas. It seeped in a pale watercolor wash of rose and gray that painted the hallowed dust of the main street. It was a time of quiet before the heat and the hardship of the day began. And in that quiet the church stood as the town's sole anchor, its steeple, a lonely finger pointing toward a heaven that felt very far away. This was Theodora's world. As the late pastor's daughter, the church was more than a building. It was the geography of her soul, a sanctuary of peace she tended with a gentle, unwavering hand. She moved through the pre-dawn chill, her shawl pulled tight, her purpose to unbolt the heavy oak doors and let the morning light in. But the light had revealed a shadow that did not belong. It was slumped on the top step, a grotesque mockery of a parishioner at prayer. Not a man, not at first. Just a shape. A formless, kneeling lump shrouded in the coarse brown texture of a large grain sack. It was a sacrilegious stillness, an omen left on her doorstep. Her first thought was of a drunk who had wandered from the saloon, but there was a terrible, deliberate neatness to it that chilled her to the bone. She crept closer, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She could see the details now. The sack was pulled down over the figure's head, an entire torso cinched brutally tight at the waist with a length of rope. There were no visible hands. It was a package. A human parcel delivered to God's house. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her calm. She did not scream. Her father had taught her that panic was a luxury no one in this land could afford. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the silent, terrible shape, and ran. Her frantic knocking echoed from the door of the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Brody," she called, her voice tight with a controlled urgency. "You have to come. To the church. There's something you need to see." Sheriff Brody emerged, a man who looked as weary as the town itself. His shoulders were slumped under the weight of his badge, and his eyes held the cynical, tired gaze of a man who had seen too much and changed too little. But at the sight of Theodora's pale, determined face, he straightened slightly. "What is it, Miss Theodora?" "I can't explain it," she said, already leading him back down the street. "You just have to see." By the time they returned, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the strange spectacle. Whispers slithered through the morning air, ugly and immediate. "It's an Indian." A blacksmith muttered, his hands clenching into fists. "A curse on our town." "Look at it," a woman hissed from behind her curtain. "Some kind of devil worship. On the church steps. Just shoot the varmint." "Brody," another man yelled, "put it out of its misery." Sheriff Brody ignored them, his attention fixed on the hooded figure. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer, a final deadly sound in the tense air. He was a man caught between the town's prejudice and his own sworn duty. And then it came. A sound that cut through the hateful murmurs and the sheriff's indecision. A sound so human and so terribly out of place it defied all reason. A thin, muffled cry. The desperate wailing sound of a baby. The crowd fell silent, their anger turning to stunned, open-mouthed disbelief. The cry seemed to emanate from the chest of the hooded figure itself. Brody's face went pale. He looked at Theodora, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of horror and a fierce, sudden compassion. "Hold your fire," the sheriff commanded, his voice a low growl. He holstered his pistol and drew a long skinning knife. He moved forward, the whole town holding its breath. With a single decisive motion, he sliced the burlap sack from top to bottom. The rough fabric fell away. Kneeling there, hands bound tight, was a young Comanche warrior. His face was bruised and defiant, his dark eyes blazing with a proud, unbroken fire. And nestled in the space between his chest and his bound arms, wrapped in a small tattered blanket, was a pale, blue-eyed white infant, its small mouth open in a heartbreaking cry. The warrior Nakona lifted his head. His gaze swept past the hostile crowd, past the stunned sheriff, and locked directly onto Theodora's. It was not the look of a killer or a kidnapper. It was a silent, desperate plea, a message delivered to the only person in this godforsaken town who might be willing to read it. The cell was a cage of stone and shadow, the air thick with the scent of rust and fear. Nakona sat on the hard cot, a figure of coiled stillness, his pride a shield against the hostile world outside the bars. Through the small barred window he could hear the angry murmur of the town, a low, constant threat that buzzed like hornets. He was an animal in a zoo, a spectacle for their hatred. He had expected this. He had prepared for it. What he had not prepared for was her. Theodora returned, not with the sheriff or a guard, but alone. She carried the baby, now swaddled in a clean, soft blanket from the church's charity box. She moved with a quiet purpose that seemed to push back against the oppressive atmosphere of the jail. She did not look at Nakona, not at first. She focused on the child, setting up a small cradle in the corner of Sheriff Brody's office, just within the warrior's line of sight. Nakona watched her, every movement, the way she warmed milk over a small stove, the gentle, practiced way she held the infant, her fingers stroking his downy hair. There was a reverence in her touch, a deep well of compassion in her eyes that was a world away from the violent hatred outside. After the baby was settled, she approached the cell. She carried a bowl of clean water and a strip of linen. She set them on the floor just outside the bars. "You're hurt?" she said, her voice soft but steady. "The ropes, they cut your wrists. This will help." Nakona remained silent, his gaze fixed on the far wall, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He would accept nothing from them. To accept kindness was to accept their power over him. Theodora did not press. She simply nodded, as if to herself. "He needs a name," she continued, her gaze drifting toward the sleeping infant. "I cannot just call him the boy. A person deserves a name. It is the first thing we are given." She looked back at Nakona, a question in her eyes. Did his mother give him a name? The warrior's jaw tightened, the only sign that he had heard her. She sighed softly. "Very well." She lingered for a moment longer, then retreated to the office, leaving the bowl of water where it was. As he sat in the deepening shadows watching her rock, the cradle, the walls of the cell seemed to dissolve. The memory came unbidden. Sunlight thick and golden filtering through the leaves of a cottonwood tree. A cabin not of grim stone but of warm, hand-hewn logs. A woman, Sarah Miller, with hair the color of corn silk, laughing as she hung laundry, her voice a melody against the hum of the prairie. Her husband, a gentleman with calloused hands, teaching Nakona a phrase in English, the two of them sharing a joke. And the baby, just a small bundle, then cradled in his mother's arms. It was a memory of peace. A memory of a family that had looked at him and seen not a savage but a friend. He was pulled back to the present by Theodora's voice. She had approached the cell again. "He has his mother's eyes," I think she said quietly, as if thinking aloud. Whatever happened out there, she must have loved him very much. Her words were a spark on dry tinder. The image of peace in his mind shattered, replaced by fire and smoke. Another memory. The scream of horses. The crack of rifles that was not a hunter's shot. The smell of burning canvas. He saw them, Jedediah Kane's men, their faces twisted with a greed that was a kind of madness. He saw Sarah's husband fall, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He saw the world he had found a small pocket of impossible peace being ripped apart by a casual, brutal evil. The final memory was the worst. Sarah dying in the dirt behind the burning cabin, her life a fading stain on the thirsty ground. She had pressed the baby into his arms, her hands surprisingly strong. Her blue eyes, already clouding over, found his. Promise me, she had begged, her voice a ragged whisper. Redemption Gulch. The church. The girl there. Theodora. She is good. She helps the lost. Promise me, Nakona. Keep him safe. He had given his word. A vow made in blood and ash. Back in the present, in the sterile silence of the jail, Theodora was changing the baby's soiled wrappings. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Her fingers, nimble and quick, found a small, hard lump sewn into the thick hem of the blanket. It was deliberate, hidden. With a small pair of scissors from her sewing kit, she carefully unpicked the threads. Inside was a small, folded piece of oilskin. She opened it. There, protected from the elements, were 2 items. The first was a tiny, faded, tin-type photograph of Sarah and her husband smiling into a future they would never have. The second was a scrap of paper torn from a journal. On it, in elegant feminine script, was a single word, a name, a destination. Theodora. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked from the name scrawled on the paper to the silent, watching warrior in the cell. Her eyes widened with the stunning, terrible weight of the truth. This was not a random act of violence. This was not a kidnapping. This was a delivery, a sacred promise. And she, for reasons she could not possibly comprehend, was its final intended destination. Miles away, where the dusty plains gave way to rolling green hills and vast herds of cattle, Jedediah Kane received the news. He stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch house, a pristine white fortress in a land of grit and turmoil. He was a man dressed in tailored Eastern suits, but his eyes held the cold, predatory stillness of a desert hawk. He listened as his foreman spoke, his expression unchanging, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. A Comanche. A white baby, at the church in Redemption Gulch. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His anger was a cold, sharp thing, a blade he kept carefully sheathed. A loose end. He said, his voice a low, dangerous purr as he stared out at the land he owned, the land he coveted. And a complication. He turned his gaze, pinning the foreman to the spot. Saddle my horse. And gather the boys. It seems Sheriff Brody needs a lesson in civic duty. Kane's arrival in Redemption Gulch was not an event. It was a shift in the very atmosphere. The wind seemed to quiet. The townsfolk, who'd been milling about with a nervous, angry energy, now straightened up, their expressions turning from outrage to a kind of fearful reverence. He was their founder, their benefactor, their king. He dismounted in front of the jailhouse, his polished boots immaculate in the dust. He did not knock. He entered, his 2 largest foremen flanking him, their presence sucking the air from the small office. Sheriff Brody rose from his desk a little too quickly. Jedediah, he said, his voice strained. Didn't expect to see you. Kane's eyes swept the room, ignoring the sheriff for a moment. They passed over the cradle where the baby slept and then settled on Theodora, who stood protectively beside it. A thin, cold smile touched his lips. Miss Theodora, he said, his tone dripping with false piety. A pastor's daughter, giving comfort to the lost. A noble sentiment. But your father was a man of God, not a fool. He knew how to separate the lambs from the wolves. His gaze finally fell upon Brody. And you sheriffs seem to have forgotten how. I hear you have a situation." "We're handling it, Jedediah," Brody replied, wiping a sweaty palm on his trousers. "Following procedure." "Procedure?" Kane let out a soft, contemptuous laugh. "The man in that cell is a savage and a murderer. He is the one who slaughtered the Miller family out on the flats. You know it." "I know it." He leaned forward, placing his gloved hands on Brody's desk. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "The good people of this town are scared, Brody. They want justice. They want to see a rope." He wasn't suggesting. He was giving an order. "I can't just hand him over to a mob, Jedediah." "That's not the law," Brody stammered. "The law." Kane's eyes glittered. "I am the law in this valley. I built this town from nothing. Do not forget who signs your pay drafts." He straightened up, turning his cold charisma on Theodora again. "Take the child home, Miss Theodora. This is no place for a woman of your sensitivities. Leave the men to their work." The threat was clear. He wanted her gone. He wanted the baby out of sight. He wanted Nakona erased. Kane left as quickly as he had come, his poison left to fester in the office. The effect was immediate. The mood outside, once just a murmur, now grew into a low, angry growl. Theodora looked out the window and saw the faces of her neighbors, people she had known her whole life, now twisted with the fear and hatred that Kane had expertly stoked. Someone threw a rock that clattered against the barred window of Nakona's cell. The sanctuary had become a cage for all of them. Sheriff Brody paced the room like a trapped animal. "He'll do it," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "He'll bring a mob. He'll tear this place apart." Theodora watched him, her heart cold with a new kind of resolve. She had seen the truth in Nakona's eyes, and she had seen the lie in Kane's. "He's afraid," she said, her voice cutting through Brody's panicked muttering. Brody stopped staring at her. "Afraid Jedediah Kane ain't afraid of God nor the devil." "He's afraid of that baby," she insisted, "and he's afraid of the man in that cell. And this is why." She walked to the cradle and retrieved the small oilskin pouch. She unfolded it on the sheriff's desk, the tintype photo, and the small, creased piece of paper. Brody picked it up. He stared at the photo of Sarah Miller and her husband, a young homesteader he vaguely remembered. He read the single elegant word on the paper, Theodora, and then he read the other note. She pointed to the one she'd found tucked inside the blanket, written in the same hand. "I, Sarah Miller, name my son William Miller sole heir to the Miller homestead and all its water rights." The color drained from the sheriff's face. He understood. It wasn't about a random killing. It was about land. It was about water. It was about an inheritance. Kane hadn't been demanding justice for the Millers. He had been trying to eliminate the last two obstacles to stealing their legacy. The man in his cell wasn't a murderer. He was a witness. And the baby in the cradle wasn't an orphan. He was the reason for it all. Brody sank into his chair, the weight of the truth, a physical blow. Outside, the angry voices of the town grew louder, a rising tide of manipulated fury. The walls of the jailhouse, his fortress of law, suddenly felt like they were closing in. Sheriff Brody stared at the evidence on his desk, the world outside his window a rising chorus of angry, manipulated voices. The tintype photo. The child's legal claim. Theodora's name written in a dead woman's hand. Each item was a nail being hammered into the coffin of the comfortable, compromised life he had led. His mind was a battlefield. On one side stood the specter of Jedediah Kane, the man who had given him his badge, the man who owned every brick and every soul in Redemption Gulch. To defy him was to sign his own death warrant. Kane would crush him, burn his office to the ground, and the town would likely thank him for it. Fear, cold and sharp, was a familiar companion. It advised silence. It advised survival. But on the other side was the truth, stark and undeniable, laid bare on his desk. And there was Theodora standing before him, her gaze not pleading, but demanding. She was not asking for his help. She was asking him to be the man his badge proclaimed him to be. "He will form a lynch mob by noon." Brody muttered the words, tasting like defeat. "There's nothing I can do. He'll tear the town apart to get to that man. And you will let him." Theodora's voice was quiet, but it cut through his fear with the clean, sharp edge of a blade. "My father, who wore that star before you, used to say it wasn't a shield to hide behind, Sheriff. He said it was a standard, a promise, one you're meant to carry even if you must carry it alone." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at the tarnished silver star sitting on his desk. A standard, a promise. How long had it been since he thought of it as anything more than a weight? He looked at her, at the unwavering strength in her young face, a strength he had long ago surrendered. And in that moment the fear did not vanish, but it was eclipsed by a different, older feeling, a bitter, burning shame. He took a deep breath, the first clean breath of a man making a choice. His shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, straightened. He picked up the star and with a steady hand pinned it back onto his vest. He walked to the cell where Nakona sat, a silent, watchful statue. He did not look at the Comanche warrior as a prisoner. He looked at him as the keeper of a truth that could either save them or get them all killed. He took the heavy iron key from his belt and with a decisive turn unlocked the cell door. The sound echoed in the tense office, a sound of finality, a point of no return. The door swung inward. Nakona did not move, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. Brody did not enter the cell. He stood in the doorway, a gesture of respect, of equality. "I need you to tell me everything," the sheriff said, his voice low and steady, stripped of its earlier wavering. "Not the whispers the town is shouting. Not the lies Kane is selling. The truth." Nakona's gaze shifted from Brody to Theodora. He saw her standing behind the sheriff, her expression a mixture of fear and resolute faith. He was not being asked to trust the lawman. He was being asked to trust the woman who had shown him kindness. Her small, almost imperceptible nod was the only answer he needed. For the first time, Nakona spoke. His voice was a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together, the voice of a man who had not spoken in days, who had perhaps forgotten the use of words in a world of violence. He told them of the Miller homestead, not as a place, but as a feeling, a rare patch of peace in a harsh land. He spoke of Sarah Miller's laughter, of her husband's honest hands. He spoke not with anger, but with a profound, chilling sadness that filled the small room. Kane wanted the water, he said, his English slow but clear. The creek on their land runs even when the sun burns the world to dust. He offered to buy. Miller said no. He said the land was for his child. He described the attack, the sudden merciless slaughter, and he revealed the final missing piece of the puzzle. Sarah's husband. He had a friend, a white trapper named Elias. He knew Kane would hunt the child. The sack, the silence. It was his plan. A way to deliver a message without a voice, a way to pass Kane's patrols. Nakona's eyes grew dark with a new pain. Kane's men found Elias 2 days ago. They silenced him too. I was the last resort. The story was complete, a tapestry of greed, murder, and a desperate sacred promise. Brody's last shred of doubt turned to a cold, hard rage. He was no longer a compromised man. He was a lawman with a righteous cause. He turned to the map on his wall, his eyes blazing with a new fire. "He thinks he owns this town," Brody growled. "He thinks he can buy his own justice with a rope and a lie." He looked at the unlikely pair before him, the pastor's daughter whose faith was a weapon, and the Comanche warrior whose testimony was the truth. an uneasy trinity bound by a desperate cause. He is coming for you. Brody said, his gaze locked on Nakona. He'll bring a mob, and they will tear this jail apart. He then looked at Theodora. And he will try to silence you. He tapped the map. He may own the saloon and the gallows, but he doesn't own the church, and he doesn't own the law. His voice was iron once more, but it was a different kind of iron. Not the cold, brittle iron of fear, but the white-hot, tempered steel of a man who had finally chosen his side. Not anymore. The mob came with the high noon sun, a wave of dust, sweat, and righteous fury. They were not a faceless mass to Brody. He saw the faces of men he knew, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, ranchers, their features twisted by a fear expertly wielded by the man at their head. Jedediah Kane rode before them, not as a ruffian, but as a patriarch, a founding father leading his flock to a holy cleansing. They carried torches that seemed obscene in the bright daylight, their flames a testament to the irrational fire Kane had lit in their hearts. Inside the jail, the air was still and cold. The uneasy trinity stood ready. Brody, his shotgun held with a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. Nakona by the window, a silent shadow armed with a rifle. His eyes not on the mob, but on their leader, a look of cold, patient reckoning. And Theodora, holding the sleeping baby, her other hand clutching the oilskin pouch. It was her testimony, her weapon. Brody Kane's voice boomed across the street, a sound used to absolute obedience. Last chance. Give us the savage. The people of this town demand justice. Sheriff Brody stepped out onto the porch, a lone figure of defiance. The silver star on his chest seemed to shine brighter in the harsh sun. The only justice in this town is the one my badge represents. Jedediah Brody's voice rang out clear and firm, silencing the mob for a heartbeat. And it ain't for sale. Not anymore. Now you all turn around and go home before you do something you can't take back. Kane simply smiled, a cruel, confident slash. Brave words, Sheriff. He raised a hand, a signal for his men to advance. They'll be your last. That was the signal. While all eyes were on the standoff, on the inevitable explosion of violence at the jail, Theodora slipped out the back door. She moved through the dusty, forgotten alleys, a ghost in her own town. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps were certain. This was her part to play. Not as a caregiver, not as a victim, but as a witness. She reached the church, its cool, silent interior, a world away from the heat and hatred outside. She did not pause to pray. Her prayer was in her actions. Her hands found the thick, dusty bell rope. For a moment she looked up into the darkness of the belfry. Then she closed her eyes and pulled with all her might. Bong. The first toll was a shock, a deep, resonant sound that cut through the angry shouts of the mob like a judgment from God. Kane and his men stopped, turning in confusion toward the sound. Bong. Another toll, loud and insistent. It was not the gentle Sunday summons. This was an alarm, a call to witness. Bong. Townsfolk who had been hiding in their homes began to emerge, drawn by a sound that was both sacred and terrifying. They moved toward the church, a second larger crowd, one of confusion, not of anger. When Theodora appeared at the top of the church steps, the bell finally falling silent, every eye in Redemption Gulch was on her. She stood there, the pastor's daughter, a figure of unimpeachable grace, holding the white baby in her arms. You have been told a lie. Her voice, clear and strong, carried across the stunned silence. Kane's face darkened, a flash of fury in his eyes. You were told a savage murdered the Miller family and stole this child. Theodora continued, her voice rising with a passion that came from pure, righteous anger. But the savage is the man who sent you here, the man who wants the Miller land for himself. She held the baby up for all to see. This is not a stolen child. This is William Miller, the son of Sarah and John Miller and the rightful heir to their legacy. A gasp rippled through the crowd. At that moment, the door to the sheriff's office flew open. Brody and Nakona emerged, dragging a third man between them, one of Kane's foremen, his face pale with terror. "It's over," Jedediah Brody shouted, shoving the foreman to his knees in the middle of the street. "Your man here has told us everything about the massacre, about the promise of a bonus for silencing the last witness. The truth revealed in a stunning 1-2 punch shattered Kane's power." The faces in the mob turned from Brody to Kane, their expression shifting from blind loyalty to dawning horror and suspicion. They were not a lynch mob anymore. They were witnesses to a different crime. Kane saw it all slipping away. The town, the land, the lies. His face contorted the mask of the patriarch falling away to reveal the snarling beast beneath. "This town is mine," he roared, and his hand flew to the silver-plated pistol at his hip. But Nakona was faster. He had been waiting for this moment his entire life, it seemed. His rifle was a blur of motion. A single shot cracked through the air. Kane staggered, a look of shocked disbelief on his face before he drew his gun. The street erupted. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Brody and Nakona, standing side by side, a lawman and a warrior united, fired with cold, precise fury. Kane's few loyalists returned fire, their shots wild and panicked. When the smoke cleared, Jedediah Kane lay dead in the dust of the town he had built on a foundation of lies. Silence fell absolute and profound. The reign of terror was over. The bell of justice had been rung, and its final toll was the sound of a tyrant falling. In the deafening silence that followed the fall of Jedediah Kane, the town of Redemption Gulch seemed to take its first shuddering breath of clean air. The body of the tyrant lay in the dust of the street he once owned, a stark and final testament to a reign built on fear. The mob no longer a single hateful beast, but a scattered collection of shamed and bewildered men slowly dispersed, unable to meet each other's eyes. The reckoning was over. The healing was yet to begin. Sheriff Brody, his face grim but his shoulders straight, moved through the aftermath with a newfound authority. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the weary resolve of a man who had walked through fire and chosen to be forged by it, not consumed. He was a lawman again, in the truest sense of the word. Nakona stood apart, a silent, watchful figure. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, but their avoidance was no longer born of hatred. It was a complex mixture of awe, gratitude, and a deep, unsettling shame for their own blindness. He was the savage they had wanted to hang, and he had been more civilized than any of them. Weeks passed. The seasons began to turn, and with them, the soul of the town. Redemption Gulch began to live up to its name. Under Brody's steady hand, a new order took root, one based on truth, not terror. The church with Theodora at its heart became a true sanctuary, a place where food was shared and wounds both visible and not began to mend. By the town's own consensus, Theodora was made the legal guardian of William Miller, the infant heir who was the quiet catalyst for it all. Nakona stayed. He had no other place to go. His past was a landscape of ash, his future an unmarked trail. He helped Brody track the last of Kane's loyalists who had fled into the hills. He taught the blacksmith how to read the signs of weather in the clouds. He moved on the edges of the town's new life, a respected ghost, a living legend the children whispered about. His promise to the dead had been fulfilled. His purpose now was a question mark hanging in the vast, open sky. He and Theodora rarely spoke of the terrible night. They did not need to. A language had grown between them, one of quiet glances, of shared silence, of small unspoken kindnesses. He would leave a brace of quail on her doorstep in the morning. She would leave a fresh loaf of bread for him at the jailhouse in the evening. It was a courtship of ghosts, two lonely souls learning to navigate the geography of a new world. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley, she found him in the church garden watching the last of the light paint the mesas in hues of purple and gold. "The world is quiet now," she said, her voice as soft as the twilight. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the endless plains. "Quiet is good." She stood beside him, the scent of the desert sage sharp and clean around them. "Sheriff Brody told me he offered you a deputy's star," she said. "He said the town owes you more than it can ever repay, that you have a place here if you want it." It was the question that had been hanging between them for weeks. Nakona was silent for a long time, the wind stirring his long dark hair. "A star is a heavy thing to wear," he said finally. "It is the white man's burden. My burdens are different." He turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. The intensity in them still made her heart catch. "My world is gone, the one I was born to. This is a good place. You have made it good. You helped make it," so she whispered. "You have a right to be here. A right to be at peace." Peace. A rare sad smile touched his lips. "My path has always been on the wind, Theodora. I do not know if I would recognize peace if I found it." Her heart sank. It was a farewell. But then he continued, his voice softening. "I will not wear the star. It is not my law to keep." He looked toward the small orphanage wing of the church where the faint sound of a baby's sleepy cry could be heard. But the boy, William, this land is his inheritance now. An heir to the Miller Ranch cannot be a stranger to the earth he owns. He will need to learn it. How to read the tracks of the coyote. How to know the seasons from the taste of the air. How to listen to what the river says. He turned fully to her then, and in his eyes she saw not an ending but a new, uncertain beginning. "The town does not need another lawman," he said. "But the boy will need a teacher." Tears welled in Theodora's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. "Then you'll stay." For a time he answered, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. The seasons change. It was not the promise of forever. It was not a vow. It was something more real. A commitment to the present. A choice to plant a root, however shallow, in the soil that had been consecrated by so much blood and sacrifice. They stood together in the fading light, not touching but closer than they had ever been. A man who had lost his world, and a woman who had found hers. The future was an unwritten page, but for the first time in the quiet heart of a small town called Redemption, it was a story they might just be able to write together.